Hello, everyone, and welcome, and happy Earth Day. What a perfect backdrop to tonight's conversation. I am Marusiak Gaprelian, Assistant Professor of Landscape Architecture and Urbanism at the School of Architecture at USC and Director of the Landscape Futures Lab. Together with Alison Hirsch, Associate Professor and Director of the Landscape Architecture and Urbanism Program, we are the co-curators of this series. Before we begin today's conversation on shaky grounds, I'd like to acknowledge the grounds from which some of us are speaking today. Both Alison and I are located on the ancestral grounds of the Gabrielino Tangwa people, who historically inhabited the San Gabriel Valley area around present-day Pasadena and Altadena. We also acknowledge the grounds on which our institution, the University of Southern California, sits, which is the indigenous land of the Tangwa people, along with the Chumash, Tataviam, Serrano, Coahuila, Juaneño, and Luceño people who are associated with the lands that USC also occupies around Southern California. We pay our respects to the traditional caretakers of this land, their ancestors, elders, and relations past, present, and forthcoming. It's critical not only to acknowledge the genocide, slavery, violence, displacement, and settlement that brings us here today, but to actively address the particular harms that settler colonialism and institutions who benefit from colonialism, including USC, perpetuate on indigenous lands and peoples. We recognize this land acknowledgement is limited and requires us to engage in an ongoing process of learning and accountability through action. I'd like to also recognize the team of students who have been assisting us throughout the process: Jared Edgar McKnight, Hannah Michael Flynn, and Leslie Dinkin. Thank you all. We're also extremely grateful for the Landscape Justice Initiative and the generosity of the Grant and Shea Kirkpatrick Landscape Architecture and Urbanism Leadership Fund, which has made this series possible. Tonight's conversation on shaky ground is the fifth in the series, building on and extending beyond the themes that were explored through the first 4 panels. Material grounds, which focused on deep consideration of the ground's physical matter. Working grounds, which engaged the embodied practice of work as it relates to the physicality of the ground. Ancestral grounds, which focused on the connections of indigenous communities to the material of the ground, including the stories and myths that it continues to tell. And archival grounds, which was the last one, which focused on the ground both as witness and material testimony to both human deeds and misdeeds and non-human forces, among other themes. All previous conversations have been recorded and are archived on our website, and we welcome you to visit should you have missed them live. Grounds across the group in tonight's conversation exhibit geophysical uncertainty, geopolitical instability, chemical toxification, or alternatively are celebrated as a gradient of wetness outside the colonial conceptions of terra firma. All grounds are explored as colonized, occupied, militarized, and/or as implicated in colonial knowledge production. All are material, tectonics, soil, water, materials that are animate and dynamic, that don't behave according to anthropogenic forces of control. We're extremely grateful to have you all here today to discuss shaky grounds. The moderator tonight is one of our own, DAVI SCHOEN, who is a lecturer in the Landscape Architecture and Urbanism program here at USC Architecture, and an associate at STOSS Landscape Urbanism's LA office. DAVI is a landscape architect, writer, urbanist, and researcher whose work is focused on 2 primary themes: environmental risk mitigation and displacement, and landscape infrastructure in cities of the global South, especially Latin America. Thanks so much for leading our conversation tonight, DAVI. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Rosiak. I'd like to start by thanking the guests who are with us tonight and the curatorial team that's put this incredible series together, and to all those who have contributed and engaged in all the previous discussions. Let me pull up my slides. Okay. As Rosiak started to lay out, tonight's conversation is on shaky grounds. So I'll briefly lay out some framings here and introduce our wonderful guests, after which they'll each spend about 10 minutes presenting before we open it up to a discussion. In its common use, shaky grounds carries at least two adjoining sets of meanings. It can describe the material conditions of instability. For example, that structure was built on shaky ground, as well as the immaterial, whether logical or emotional, let's say an argument or a legal case that rests on shaky ground. The shaky grounds we'll discuss tonight are prone to change, at times quickly, at others over long durations, although always contingent on one's framing and perspective. These are the sites of flood, flow, subsidence, slide, desiccation, and other shifts that are produced by interaction between geophysical forces and human inhabitations and practices. These places are often framed as exceptions to an implicit state of stability, fixity, and the illusion of permanence. These are sites upon which imagined lines disappear from planimetric view, or stratifications are compressed into something new. In popular media or the language of international development, these places are often identified as vulnerable or at risk of disasters. From this perspective, change is often rendered as a discrete event, a moment of rupture within, rather than a continuous process. These events then often justify mitigative action towards stabilization or other attempts at normalizations. In varied ways, tonight's guests call into question the foundational assumptions that both produce and identify ground as shaky, often through the denaturalization of perspectives, narratives, disciplines, tools, and practices. In doing so, their work grapples with the multiple conflicts, contestations, and occupations playing out across these grounds. I'll now present two stories of shaky grounds related to my own work. This is Comunidade do Horto in Rio de Janeiro, a community that sits depending on how and from where you see it, either within or at the edge of Floresta da Tijuca, the forest that makes up the background of many a postcard of the city. Comunidade do Horto also sits, again, depending on how and from where you see it, either within or at the edge of Rio's botanical garden. Comunidade do Horto is also, again, depending on how you see it, shaky ground. For the better part of 3 decades, the city has mobilized maps of biophysical vulnerability, such as these, in attempts to forcefully evict hundreds of families, invoking the risk of landslide and flooding, as well as the potential damage to the adjacent forest. These attempts have been met with resistance from community members and activists. And while the city attempts to impose fixity through the identification of categories of risk that justify evictions, residents here have pushed back through the reassertion of their historic claims and ties to this place, with many current residents tracing those claims back to their ancestors who labored in the garden. The land itself has been marked by legacies of degradation following European colonization, from deforestation to the intensive cultivation of sugar, cane, and coffee, and their attendant histories of violence, extraction, and exploitation. Here, when agricultural cultivation moved elsewhere in the colony, this area became the back of house for the adjacent Imperial Botanic Garden, and the surrounding hillsides were reforested with the labor of Afro-Brazilian slaves. In the interceding years, the forest has become naturalized, so to speak, both ecologically and in the broader cultural imaginary, to the point where the forest is taken as having always been there, idealized as pristine and a historical place untouched by human actors. Today, the overlapping histories that have marked occupation of this place are contested. At stake is not just the legal title and claim to the land, but a fundamental difference in how this place is understood. For the city, displacing residents from these forested hillsides addresses an environmental problem. For residents, not only are the social and the environmental inextricably linked, but more, their inhabitation is proof of both their historical and contemporary stewardship of the forest. This is perhaps most emblematically seen in the mutirões, which are a tradition of communal labor, often focused on cleanup, planting, or other stewardship-related efforts, both in the community and forest. So Comunidade do Horto, I want to suggest tonight, is emblematic of the kinds of contestations that often play out on shaky grounds, in the present, historically, and over that history itself, and how these then can resist simplifications in state efforts at stabilizations. Story 2. The second story begins with this place, then known as Morro da Favela. Located on a hill in downtown Rio behind the Federal War Ministry, it was occupied in the 1890s by returning soldiers who had been promised housing. When the government failed to deliver, the occupation became permanent. And where were these soldiers returning from? They had been called in to violently repress a place called Canudos, a radical autonomous commune in what's known as the Brazilian Sertão, a semi-arid, drought-prone landscape stretching across the country's northeast. When federal soldiers returned to Rio, the hill they inhabited was named after the favela plant that had been abundant in the Sertão and Canudos. The names stuck and eventually would be taken on by other communities settled on similar grounds. Throughout the course of the 20th century, especially in times of extensive drought, migration from the desiccated grounds of the Sertão propelled urban growth, especially in cities like Rio. Many of these migrants came to occupy the most readily available urban lands, often on the city's peripheries and in environmental conditions prone to change, including along coastlines, rivers, and hillsides. Today, elevation retains an important role in the determination of who inhabits what grounds and who is allowed to remain there. The city of Rio, for example, identifies the occupation of lands over 100 meters above sea level as a key criteria in their biophysical classification of risk, a spatialization of risk which I believe largely ignores the histories that have shaped the sectional occupation of these sites. Moreover, once classified, these places are, unsurprisingly, inconsistently targeted for normalization. The two communities here, for example, occupy similar geological conditions, but experience different levels of precarity and uncertainty with the continued threat of evictions, displacement, and other attempts at so-called stabilization, and reflective of their underlying social and political marginalization. In a city in which 70% of the structures above 100 meters are occupied by those of the lowest socioeconomic strata, this means that displacement justified as risk mitigation disproportionately affects poor and predominantly Black and Brown communities. In Rio then, prevailing state attitudes towards shaky grounds often penalize those who have come to occupy them and ignore or obscure the history of the production of these spaces. They're also often the sites of contestation between, on the one hand, practices and attendant epistemologies of risk management engaged in identifying and imposing fixity through strategies including evictions, and on the other hand, communities that resist these through practices of inhabitation that embrace the tight entanglement between the social and the environmental. The shared histories I've laid out through these two stories connect disparate places across time and space through drought and migration, violent repression, and plant life. These traces, I want to suggest, provide a framing of shaky grounds as interconnected places of possibilities, which offer narratives and ways of seeing and creating a world amenable and open to change. And here I'm reminded of the prophecy uttered by the leader of Canudos, seen here, Antônio Conselheiro, that one day o sertão vai virar mar, o mar vai virar sertão. That is, the arid backlands will become an ocean and the ocean arid. May we engage with this sort of transformative possibility tonight. And with that, I'd like to stop sharing and briefly introduce our incredible guests before turning it over to them. And in the sake of time, I'll keep these intros and bios short, but encourage you all to seek out and read their incredible work. So first tonight will be anthropologist and ethnographer Christina Lyons, assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania and author of Vital Decomposition. She'll be followed by DEBJANI DUTTA, who is a doctoral candidate in cinema and media studies at the USC School of Cinematic Arts, currently working on tremulous media, nature, technology, and the seismic imagination. Then we'll have artist and geographer Juanita Sundberg, associate professor in the Department of Geography at the University of British Columbia, who this evening will be focusing on the unstable grounds of border enforcement in the Sonoran Desert. and concluding the presentations prior to our discussion, Mathur, Professor of Landscape Architecture at the University of Pennsylvania, and DILIP Cunha, Professor at Columbia University, both founders and principals of Mathur Cunha and authors of books including Mississippi Floods, Soak in the Train of Water, and The Invention of Rivers. And with that, we'll turn it over to Christina.
Okay, so I would like to thank everyone for attending this virtual conversation on Shaky Grounds today, and especially the USC Interdisciplinary group for the invitation to this really interesting series and amazing series that you've all curated. So my proposition for the conversation today is called Thinking with Hojarasca, Litter Layers, Soils and What Resists Becoming Soil in the Age of the Anthropocene. And the first little section is called Cackle and Cultivation. So I begin with an important ethnographic inspired conceptual lesson taught to me by an animal husbandry technician and small farmer. And our conversation occurred in the Andean Amazonian foothills of Colombia, where I've been conducting fieldwork and accompanying what I call agro-life popular processes since 2004. And this is a region that was an epicenter of not only 50 years of armed conflict between leftist guerrillas, right-wing paramilitary organizations, and state armed forces, but is also a continued focal point of militarized US-Colombia anti-narcotics policy since the late 1990s. And this farmer friend, Heraldo Vallejo, explained to me that modernizing agricultural practices and neo-colonial legacies of extractivism had alienated rural communities to the point where they, quote unquote, do not know where they are standing. And I would learn that not knowing where one is standing does not refer to knowing the soil through a laboratory analysis of its chemical fertility, pH level, or scientific taxonomy, or necessarily knowing any kind of stable entity. Indeed, Heraldo demonstrated how rather than sending a soil sample off to an urban laboratory and paying for its chemical analysis, farmers could compare the soil where they intend to cultivate with fecund animal manure on the farm. Applying hydrogen peroxide to both the soil and the manure, and then comparing the intensity of the effervescent cackle of microbial life is one way to determine whether soil is healthy and apt for cultivating. The reason to avoid consulting a soil science laboratory is not only a question of reducing costs and external dependencies in a precarious rural economy where local communities rarely have access to such technology. It emerges from the ontological differences between treating soils as a stable container for crop nutrients, or at best a natural body that can be routinely chemically manipulated, and interacting with soils as living worlds that are inextricable from their ecological relationalities. And thus, processual relations of forest nutrient cycling, decomposing litter layers, solar, lunar, and rain cycles, microbial plant and insect communities, and human activities. And in this photo, you can detect the thin 5 to 10 centimeter arable layer that is characteristic of many soils of the Amazon, and the way certain rootlets extend horizontally through the hojarasca, seeking nutrients, while others penetrate vertically through acidic layers of clay. I think you can also viscerally detect the intimate and recycling interplay between soils and selva, in the sense that soils are more of an ecological relation than a stable or isolatable entity. That is, soils can only exist if forest canopy, plants, and their corresponding microbial communities exist, because they all participate in the continuous nutrient cycling that mutually sustains selva and soil and everything else below, above, and in between. And these are the same soils that scientists represent often as thin, senile, and unhospitable within a USDA soil taxonomy that was imported to Colombia, precisely because these soils are said to not be productive according to industrial logics. And here I'm showing you a cartoon depiction of an Amazonian ultisol, in which collapses the heterogeneity of Amazonian soils into a single category, USDA category of the last soils. And the irony of this representation is when one considers that the millennial biodiversity of the Amazon is sustained by this thin, quote unquote, senile layer of hojarasca. So in fact, as Heraldo, returning to my farmer friend, engaged in the experiment and held the soil and manure up to his ear to listen for the intensity of the cackle, he explained to me that it was not a question of knowing, but rather of learning how to cultivate and also to recover and reclaim different practices, aptitudes, dispositions, and affects. His emphasis on open-ended processes of learning that do not result in the accumulation of universally applicable knowledge, reveals the tension that he and other farmers I've met have with not only the agricultural sciences when they are tied to productivist market imperatives, but also the category of knowledge itself, when it is separated from learning as a humbling, shared as in multilateral and not only human ongoing and situated process. Learning that entails first unlearning dominant practices and logics to relearn other ways of doing and relating. And this is not because farmers entirely reject the teachings of soil science, ecology, or microbiology, as evidenced in the opening anecdote I shared about relating to chemical versus biological soils. Rather, Heraldo and other farmers I accompanied interface with these agrarian sciences and their technological apparatuses by subjecting them to the rigor of local demands, visions, and agroecological conditions. Scientific practices that support farmers' liberation from capitalist imperatives and extractive-based logics and responsibly address and emerge from Amazonian-based problems may be incorporated into their agricultural life projects. Simultaneously, these farmers engage with specific practices they learn from their parents and extended family members, and ones they continually learn and recover in their exchanges with neighboring indigenous, Afro-descendant, and other campesinos. For example, one day Heraldo told me how his NASA indigenous neighbors taught him to plant in fields recently struck by lightning, because these fields become more fertile. The NASA had reached this conclusion by witnessing the upsurge of mushroom caps after a storm. Heraldo later read a scientific explanation about the way nitrogen molecules are shattered by lightning bolts, fertilize the air, and then penetrate the ground in falling raindrops. This was a case, he explained, where popular practices matched up with scientific ones. However, there are innumerable popular practices that have no scientific equivalent and that form part of or are actively being reincorporated back into farm and forest life. The recovery and innovational reworking of these practices is occurring after decades when rural communities eliminated most agrobiodiversity and food production to grow monoculture export-oriented coca, with stigmatizing state anti-drug campaigns called La Mata que Mata, or the plant that kills. And this brings me to the second section here of my intervention, on soils and what resists becoming soil. So in conversation with other colleagues, especially feminist and post-colonial scholars working at the interfaces of science studies and anthropology, my work asks what possibilities emerge if agro-environmental sciences push beyond simply selecting pieces of alternative or popular or indigenous knowledges that appear to match up with scientific knowledges. More specifically, how do different ways of relating to soils, including what may or may not be enacted as a scientific object called soil, produce differential economic, political, environmental policies, legal structures, technological innovations, ethical relations, and forms of territorial ordinance? Put another way, my work explores the kinds of potentialities that germinate from different sets of human-soil relations, relations that may also unravel or destabilize concepts of the human and of soil and of their hyphenated pairing. These questions and their stakes are always profoundly situated at the same time that they are critically planetary. For example, if industrialized and chemical conceptions and treatments of soil emerge from a history that is ecologically bound up with the violence and depletion, what we might refer to as anthropogenic climate change in the geologic epoch referred to as the Anthropocene, then these soils, chemical and industrialized ones, form part of the very conditions that made what we know as the Anthropocene possible. The stable, meter-deep, mineral-rich, fertile soils that have been relied upon for limitless resource extraction and economic growth, harvest after harvest of calories and profits at the hands of chemical input substitution, were always a specifically situated and never universalizable soil. It is this soil, precisely the recognition of the limits to assumptions about an unchanging standing reserve entity, that concerns over anthropogenic climate change aim to find technoscientific solutions to rescue and fix. This may be the rediscovery of the limits, fragility, and corporality of soils that has been alarmingly signaled by campaigns scaling from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the FAO 2015 Declaration of the International Year of Soils, to the National Geographic Institute Agustín Codazzi's 2009 campaign in Bogotá, the Year of Soils in Colombia, a campaign that formed part of my ethnographic field with soil scientists. It is not that a stable, fertile soil has been disturbed and provoked a crisis, but rather that capitalist agriculture has increasingly stabilized a specific idea and treatment of soil to a mechanized and rigid timetable of production that has generated volatile changes, destruction, and loss. It is this destruction that has now come back to haunt the heterogeneous field of soil science and the modern agricultural sciences more broadly, provoking a shift among scientists and other practitioners from notions of soil quality to soil health. Whenever we hear alarming statistics that read panic headlines about the accelerating degradation of the quote unquote world soils, I suggest that we ask what the world's soils occludes. I propose this in the spirit of what Marisol de la Cadena has coined the anthroponazine, or those ways of making and doing that have been disappeared and marginalized by not only multiple forces of colonization and capitalism, but also a singular optics of conventional Anthropocene thinking that uncritically assumes a blanket concept of humanity, history, and geologic record. In my research, the Nazine may include what are considered to be agriculturally, quote unquote, unproductive soils, whose particularities are actively stigmatized, forcibly corrected, or overlooked. The ongoing histories of dispossession that sever certain peoples from their territories and lands, the violent structures through which property claims are being made and perpetuated over conventionally fertile and geopolitically strategic soils, and the severing of the right of water to be absorbed by soil in floodplain zones and watersheds, just to name a few examples. Taking a step back even further, I suggest it is important to ask where soils are being enacted as a stable, albeit evolving entity, and where soils do not emerge as such, because they are inseparable from a relational continuum of human and other than human life. It was the farmers and alternative agricultural networks that I accompanied throughout the Andean, Amazonian foothills and plains that taught me to ask what we can learn from soils that never became industrialized or chemical. All those materialities that undermine and escape dominant taxonomic classifications, that have always been transitional states rather than stable entities, and that resemble litter layers, which decompositionally retire instead of lending themselves to relentless growth-oriented production. So I leave these questions open for our collective discussion. What assemblages of practices are attached to these soils or non-soils? In what worlds are these practices attempting to reclaim, imagine, cultivate, and defend? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christiane. DEBJANI.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Alison and Arusiak, for organizing this. I'll begin my presentation. In this presentation, I'm trying to draw the scientific instrument of the seismograph into a broader history of media and technology while exploring its role in colonial knowledge production. I argue that seismographic devices form part of the late 19th century landscape of inventions that transformed spatiotemporal and sense perception. Focusing on the Assam earthquake of 1897, I map its massive disruption of the technologies of public timekeeping, such as the mechanical clock, the telegraph, and the railway system. Utilizing the mechanisms of motion photography, the seismograph emerges as the most accurate medium for capturing the time and location of tectonic movements. I examine how the recording of invisible and inaudible geological phenomena would become crucial to the project of colonial expansion and consolidation. We begin in the Northeast Indian province of Assam on June 12, 1897, when an earthquake of approximately 8.0 magnitude struck an area of almost 150,000 square miles. There was widespread destruction and loss of property, but perhaps the most devastating effect of the earthquake was on the infrastructures of transport and communication. The functioning of the telegraph, railways, and mechanical clocks was affected. Railways, as you can see in this picture, railway bridges and tracks were affected. Telegraph operators reported experiencing electrical shocks from their equipment, and mechanical clocks stopped working. The standard time used by the telegraph network, as well as the railways in India, was derived from the Madras Observatory, approximately 5 hours and 21 minutes ahead of Greenwich Mean Time. Now, these technologies were at the time the primary means of calculating a public time, an official public time. Blissful Lim observes in her book, Translating Time, that scheduling the train according to the clock at a time when private watches were not yet widely available made the train's comings and goings, in effect, the authoritative public timekeeper. According to her, these technologies, along with the cinema, have a shared genealogy and display a tendency towards the technical denaturalization, homogenization, and standardization of time. Homogeneous time was not, however, established in a regular and uniform manner across India. Stephen Kern, in his book, The Culture of Time and Space, notes that in India, hundreds of local times were announced in towns by gongs, guns, and bells. Now, as Blislim notes, these technologies of speed and simultaneity were also, by their very nature, technologies for territorial conquest. The earthquake posed a significant challenge to the exertion of spatiotemporal control in India, creating an impediment to the increasing rationalization of life in the colony. It was a reminder of the geological deep time that refused to abide by the temporal categories of modernity. Now, determining the earthquake time was essential for geologists. R.D. Oldham, who headed the Geological Survey of India, believed that the most effective way of telling earthquake times was through the newly established network of the East Indian Railways. The railway stations were most likely to keep accurate times to maintain their busy schedules, and Oldham used the data collected from these stations to get a sense of the velocity and direction of the earthquake's movement, as well as its geographical reach. So like you can see in this graph, he's plotted the direction and the velocity of the earthquake's movement according to the time recorded at all these different railway stations. However, as we've seen, these means of public timekeeping were rather limited in their accuracy. And instead, the seismograph emerged as the most reliable mechanism for capturing earthquakes. The Milne horizontal pendulum seismograph, which came to be deployed across the breadth of the British Empire, utilized a photographic mechanism to produce a singular image of the time, duration, and location of an earthquake. Now, early seismologists in Britain, Germany, and Japan had speculated that tectonic movements were globally connected, and the development of more sensitive seismographic instruments aided these studies. With the outbreak of the First World War, however, international cooperation declined, and Britain emerged as the key player in establishing observatories across its colonies. The leading figure in British seismology was John Milne, who harbored a keen interest in photography. However, he was not interested in merely photographing earthquakes, but developed a seismograph that relied on a process very similar to photography. Bromide paper, widely used in photography because of its sensitivity to light, was to become a regular feature of seismographs in the late 19th century. The instrument was also adopted by the British Association as a standard observatory instrument. So as you can see here, when the earthquake struck, the boom would move, activate the lamp. The light from the lamp would be reflected onto the mirror, which would then reflected back onto this drum here with photosensitive paper. And these plates attached to the boom would move during the earthquake. Now the seismograph came to be considered a recording device that stored the physical effects of seismic waves, just as the photograph captured light waves. Photography, as André Bazin notes, allows us to embalm time and rescue it from its proper corruption. This temporal structure would prove crucial to the task of the seismograph. And much like the cinema, it produced an image of the duration of the event, an image of change mummified. Now, the horizontal pendulum seismograph's image of the earthquake's movement through time and space was similar in structure and function to Etienne Jules Maret's experiments in chronophotography. In her study of his work, Martha Brown notes that through the use of a single camera, Maret captured ongoing phases of movement and spread them over the photographic plate in an undulating pattern of overlapping segments. What emerged was a single image of frozen time that allowed one to see the unfolding phases of movement. A similar logic of the spatialization of time was at play in Milne's seismograms. Milne was treated as a bit of a prophet. He could tell the exact location of an earthquake more accurately than any information obtained from telegraphs by merely looking at a seismogram. No matter where on Earth a quake took place, the waves traveled to Milne's observatory at the Isle of Wight in exactly 16 minutes. When an earthquake struck the Chilean city of Valparaiso, for instance, scientists in London calculated with surprising accuracy its intensity and exact location. Before receiving confirmation of the disaster via telegraph almost 2 days later. This image of homogeneous time recorded on the seismogram proved to be the most effective means of consolidating territorial control, and, to use Wolfgang Schimmelbusch's phrase, annihilating space and time. Now, rather than relying on the vagaries of human perception, machines could more accurately capture the imprint of natural and physical phenomena. This desire to remove the influence of human intervention is reflected in Maret's inventions, which were considered a precursor to cinematic technologies. Francois Dagonnier notes that Maret eliminated the human hand and eye, instead bringing forth the language of the phenomenon, and allowed nature to testify without being modified by human contact. This form of autographic writing was similar to the etchings generated by a seismograph in the event of an earthquake. Just as Maret's pre-cinematic inventions captured the movement of invisible and inaudible phenomena, seismographic recordings produced direct, seemingly unmediated impressions of the rumblings of the Earth's interior. Each earthquake, according to Milne, bore its own signature and showed the distance the seismic waves have traveled. According to him, each one writes its name in its own way. It's a fine thing, isn't it, to have the Earth's crust harnessed up so that it is forced to mark down for us on paper a diagram of its own movements. Geologists and imperial officials no longer had to rely on accounts from the public or try to estimate the intensity and duration of the earthquake through other more inaccurate technologies. Instead, the seismograph offered an imprint of the event as it unfolded, allowing them to observe tectonic phenomena with greater success.
Thank you, DEBJANI. Juanita?
Thank you so much. Is that good? Excellent. All right. First, thank you so much to Alison and Arusiak for curating this exciting series and inviting me to be part of it. And thank you to DAVI for facilitating the conversation today. I want to acknowledge that UBC, the institution where I teach, is located on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. At present, I am on the ancestral homelands of the Cualhuitecan and Tancoa nations. And I ground my talk in the homelands of the O'odham peoples. Now, I acknowledge the ancestral caretakers of these lands as a part of a commitment to walk alongside Indigenous movements for self-determination. And I do hope that the work that we do today honors those struggles. In 1848, the violence of manifest destiny came to this land, disrupting the relations that constitute what we call the Sonoran Desert. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo began the work of separation, and within a few decades, parts of the desert lost its people as some O'odham were forced onto reservations. The O'odham also were forced to decide to live within the boundaries of one settler state or another, regardless of the ties extending far beyond. Emptied of its people and the sacred duties they performed, the desert was transformed into mining pits, cattle pastures, hunting grounds, and finally, wilderness through the formation of protected areas. So this is where I'm going to situate the talk here in these protected areas on the screen. Whoops. In the late 1990s, a new violence came to this land in the form of prevention through deterrence, a boundary enforcement strategy that attempted to harness the desert as an instrument to deter illegalized entries. Enforcement officials believed natural barriers such as rivers, mountains, and the harsh terrain of the desert would deter border crossers. In the first 10 years of prevention through deterrence, Operation Gatekeeper, Operation Safeguard made the land into, quote, a corridor of death, the graveyard of thousands of people who attempted to enter the US without the state's official stamp of approval. This is the story most often shared about the Sonoran Desert borderlands today, and it's probably familiar to many of you. In this short talk, I want to disrupt that story with a parallel one about life in the desert. And in this story, the desert offers shaky grounds for enforcement. Very briefly, I show how the ground mediates and even inhibits the capacity of boundary enforcement operations to harness the desert as a natural barrier and as an instrument of deterrence. The Sonoran Desert has a geologic history that extends deep into the earth and up into the sky. In this basin and range topography, jagged-edged mountains seem to suddenly rise up while flat valleys extend as far as the eye can see. On mountain slopes and in desert valleys, soils generate the ground in and on which my story takes place. As an ensemble of flora and fauna, I'm going to go back because that just looks bad. As an ensemble of flora and fauna, soils literally bequeath worlds to others. Quote, without soil, the majority of terrestrial creatures, including humans, could not exist. Although pedologists refer to soil with terms like living body or natural bodies, the words mislead, I think. Rather than unified bodies, soils are processes enacted by a multiplicity of organisms. As such, soil defies and should not be reduced to human-centric conceptualizations of the body or even our ideas of an object or a thing. Rather, soil as process challenges our very conceptions of agency, built as it is, at least in the Western thought, on assumptions of the individual human subject's capacity for conscious, intentional action. Soils have their own purpose, and soils have the capacity to do things that exceed human objectives. In this story, the desert, as the very ground on which boundary enforcement is enacted, mediates the ability of enforcement agents to accomplish their mission. And distinct soil types shake up the ground of boundary enforcement in distinct ways. The land's basin and range topography is important to this story for the ways in which it directs and facilitates passage, especially of humans, along slopes and through these flat valleys that you can see here. The flat valleys are constituted by soils that can be thousands of years old and thousands of feet deep. However, when feet or vehicles repeatedly pass over desert soils in the valley bottoms, they cause soils to compact. And this is a quote from a land manager at Cabeza Prieta National Wildlife Refuge, explaining to me how the very nature of the soils means that they basically create these huge tracts, and I'll talk more about this. the land manager talked about how the soil, as the tracks go over and over it, powder out, which means that the soil turns into this very fine powdery substance called moon dust, a term that's used colloquially. Moon dust disrupts the grounding or stabilizing function of soil, making roads impassable and challenging the smooth functioning of enforcement operations. Moon dust also results from the Border Patrol's practice of dragging tires across the desert soil to create a smooth surface that renders visible the footprints of border crossers. Now, in addition to causing potential delays as trucks get stuck in the moon dust also puts Border Patrol agents at risk. They might get stuck, and if they're stranded for long periods of time, they can suffer from dehydration and heat stroke, or face confrontations with so-called smugglers in the desert. Moon dust has forced boundary enforcement officials to expend additional energy and funds to address the very problems they are creating. And they have been using Vietnam-era landing mats, and they're placing them over these compacted and eroded soils to provide Border Patrol agents in the field with the stable ground that they require to pursue their mission. By denying the desert as alive and life-giving, Border Patrol agents find themselves on shaky grounds. Indeed, the very ground beneath their feet disintegrates. For land managers, the implications of soil compaction for communities of plants and animals are of grave concern. Especially concerning are the ways vehicle tracks in the valleys affect the flow of water from summer monsoons, which in turn affects the growth patterns of vegetation crucial to desert creatures. So a land manager explained to me, when the rain is torrential, sheet flow from the mountains starts moving down slope. And then it gets captured by these vehicle tracks, as you can see here in this image. And that starves water, the quote unquote starves water from areas that would normally green up. If there is a lot of rain, this land manager speculated, this might not be a problem because vegetation would be super abundant. But in dry years, he said, there would be a little bit of water here, 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 and here. Quote, so you may not have enough forage for wildlife populations, not just pronghorn, but other things. The Border Patrol has long claimed these roads are created by illegalized entries. However, with vehicle barriers installed at the southern boundaries of these protected areas in 2006 and 2009, entries from Mexico basically ceased, although not completely. And responsibility for the vast majority of vehicles traveling on what are supposed to be unauthorized roads or off-road in areas legally designated as wilderness now falls on the Border Patrol. And federal land managers have been mapping the network of what they call unauthorized roads. I didn't say this, but in wilderness areas that are legally designated as such, there's not supposed to be any permanent or even temporary roads. So land managers have begun mapping this network. And in 2011 and 2014, their reports point to the Border Patrol's ongoing use of what are called unauthorized roads and their travel off-road. The Border Patrol disputes this charge. However, what I find fascinating is the way that the soil records and archives the stories of boundary enforcement, allowing conclusions to be drawn about commitments kept or broken. And just to conclude, at stake in this story that I want to tell are ways of worlding. Boundary enforcement builds a world that depends on and upholds hyperseparation. In contrast, desert soils invite conviviality. Ultimately, enforcing hyperseparation means eradicating convivial worlds in which other than humans are afforded some political and ethical consideration by the protected area model, which I don't want to reify as the be all and end all, but it does afford some limited protections. But what I really want to end on, and where I want to take the chapter that I'm working on, is to think about the way soil models convivial ways of life. The way soil shows us a way of being together that's built on interaction and interdependency. And for those of us who are citizens of the United States, it is our responsibility to think about what kind of worlds we would like to be a part of. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita. Anu, DILIP.
Thank you all for inviting us. Because of time, we just thought that we'll have DILIP present, and I'm happy to be part of the conversation. Thank you for these wonderful presentations thus far.
Okay. Yeah, my thanks as well to Arusiak, Alison, DAVI. Yes, so I lost the toss, and it's up to, for better or worse, you have to listen to me. What I want to speak about today, on behalf of Anu and me, is are three grounds that, that I'd like to say we have shaken. As designers. The first is the shifting ground of the Mississippi. Now, settlers, European settlers, have long sought to fix it, to fix the shifting ground of the Mississippi. They did it first with a line. Then they did it with embankments. And then after the 1927 flood, they did it with an entire system of floodways, cutoffs, jetties, water supply networks. Today, the controls are such, that even, as has been said, that water that falls in any parking lot in the entire Mississippi Valley is in some way calibrated and calculated for. Now, this is of course also a landscape of flood as a consequence of these controls and desire to contain water to a place in order to free land for settlement. Now, what we had the pleasure of doing here was to observe another possible habitation by Native Americans. Now, they lived on mounds. Now, this is not an alternate paradigm of living with a river. There's a good chance here that they did not see a river at all. What they lived with is water that rose and fell, not a river that flowed and flooded. So basically, they allowed water to be free. Yeah. Now, we've done a number of studios in this place, but what I would like to show you in this particular slide is how we applied what we learned over here with the Native American mounds to Norfolk in the Chesapeake, which is threatened here by sea level rise. We coined the term fingers of high ground and devised a system whereby the sea and water in general could be free to rise and fall. And we, as designers, work a system, not of land uses, but of time uses that operate with a new possibility of settlement in these grounds. The second ground that I'd like to present is the island, specifically the island of Bombay. Now, it was perceived as such by Europeans in the 1600s, in the 1700s, with the God's eye view from above, something totally foreign to locals and natives of India at the time. Now, the sea over here is an outsider, and the monsoon is an annual visitor. So by drawing the line between land and water, they basically created an enemy of rain that came once a year in volumes that couldn't be contained by these, by drainage systems in the island. But this was their objective. It was to drain water off the land to the sea as outside. So this vision of islands within islands, has a consequence in flood. And flood over here is seen basically as a drainage problem. We don't see it as a drainage problem. We see it as part of a much larger problem that includes a lot of other issues: poverty, drought, pollution, etc. And we see it actually as a problem of island imagination. So we proposed an alternative here of estuarian imagination, Mumbai in an estuary rather than Bombay as an island. So over here, the sea is an insider and the monsoon is resident. Yeah. So you have over here practices that on an island would be illegal, would be informal, but in an estuary are very much at home. So we did a project here, and we called it SOAK. It's not about draining water off the land, it's about holding wetness in everything. Holding wetness in the soil, holding wetness in the air, holding wetness in plants, in animals, and so forth. So flood is not a drainage problem. Flood does not even exist, if you actually embrace the paradigm of SOAK. The third ground is what we call the land water surface. Here we are questioning the Earth's surface itself. The Earth's surface, which we consider a product of design, basically bad design, that is seeing consequences now in sea level rise, in war, in issues of poverty, and so forth. I'm going to take you briefly through how this ground is designed and how it is taken for granted by all of us, primarily led by geography. Now you see here the water cycle, as drawn by Paul Clay and simplified into 4 moments. And on the right, you see a section. So we presume here, through the water cycle, that wetness is everywhere. Wetness is everywhere. Yet we see water somewhere. And that is because we posit a land surface. We posit an earth surface, there are waters above and separating waters above from waters below. Now with this surface, the surface is basically a geometric figure, a geometric conception that is totally foreign to most indigenous people. Now this surface, this geometric Euclidean surface, and I won't get into the history of who posited it, but we to some extent posit it every day as our ground of habitation. So this surface is then divided between land and water with a line, and a line that has no breadth, only length, as Euclid defined it. So what you see is actually just water and land, and that act of separation disappears into nothingness, because you don't really see it unless you, of course, bring it into presence with ecotones or gradients and so forth. But once you have separated land from water, you have an articulated surface. And now you have a ground of habitation, because what is seen below the surface is earth, and what is seen above the surface is atmosphere or sky. I'm sure that if you had to ask, natives in a number of places, indigenous peoples, what is below the surface? I mean, I'm sure they would look at you with some puzzlement. What do you mean by surface? What do you mean by below a surface? This is something that we take for granted as designers, right? So now you have a surface that is articulated, but you also have a moment in time in which we have constituted reality. You have chosen this moment, and if I just go back to this, you've chosen moment number 2 in the hydrologic cycle in which to construct reality. Because this is a moment when it is not raining, it's not evaporating, it's not cloud forming. This is a moment of clarity. It's a moment when God's eye, situated far above in the sky, can look down and actually see a surface and then divide it between land and water. So like we say, a surveyor never goes out when it's raining, never goes out when it's dark. They have to have that clarity of sight. They have to have that separation of land from water. So you posit a surface, you divide the surface, you create a map, all in a moment of time. So what happens now is rain becomes a visitor in this particular moment of time. So this space, as it were, of the Earth's surface is constituted by several moments of clarity of the surveyor and brought together, and we live with this constructed moment of the hydrologic cycle, or this constructed space in the moment of the hydrologic cycle. What we want to suggest is an alternative that we call a critical zone of wetness between clouds and aquifers, operated not by the act of separation, but by negotiation. So over here, you work with gradients of wetness, a wetness that is everywhere and not water somewhere. So you don't contain water, make it an enemy, and then design to keep it in its place. What you do is work with wetness that is everywhere through negotiated means. Now, this is a subject that has been picked up by Bruno Latour in an exhibition that's happening in Karlsruhe in Germany, where we were sort of provoked with this question of wetness is everywhere. Why do we see water somewhere? But just this last weekend, we did a wonderful workshop with 3 wonderful colleagues here in Philadelphia, with people of all ages, from little children to older folks like us, and we worked with this paradigm of wetness and asked, is it possible for us to understand a world through wetness rather than understand a world that is situated on a land-water surface? So working with wetness that is not divided to begin with, but that demands a negotiation. So we actually did this workshop where children and all of us, worked to understand nature, as it were, or let's say the world. I don't like to use that word nature because it's constituted on a land water surface, but something new that is emerging, and it will emerge through perhaps children, but we have to, I think has already been said, unlearn the paradigm of a land water surface, in order to embrace fully the paradigm of wetness, of ubiquitous wetness. I'll stop there.
Against the war on drugs and chemical warfare, that poetics and doing street performance becomes the way that we are, how to actually become a plant rootlet that's dying because their amino acids have been fumigated by glyphosate, right? And like these are the things that emerge, right, in dialogue with communities and with practitioners and with, whether we're in urban or rural or scientific or more than science or other than scientific practitioners. And so I think that's a part of at least the commitment to doing public engaged scholarship and interdisciplinary work that all of these kind of problematics and situations require, right? I mean, that is the proposal of the environmental humanities and medical humanities, that we cannot, you know, none of these proposals can just be coming from one discipline or just the disciplines, right? And in dialogue between, right? That actually we need to be engaged with artistic practitioners, we need different kinds of publics, popular knowledges, and we need the law, and we need the medical practitioner, but we also not only the public health official, right? And like these kind of things. And so that's at least the way that but I think that each of the materials also demand that we engage in different compositional and poetics. That's a politics, right? That emerges out of the work.
I guess if I could just add a little bit here, in thinking about what I'm sort of working towards in trying to, for instance, bring soil to life, which not sure I actually, you know, was able to do today, because I wasn't able to get into all the stuff and all the beings and all the relationships and the fabric and the nexus that they create and give life to. But I guess what I hope to be able to do is to create a narrative that walks alongside an indigenous cosmology, but not appropriating, but working with the sort of Western selves that I am and that my audience will probably be, but to bring these things to life, and to really convey that the border is, just for instance, the border, this land, this place, these relationships are yeah, we're not talking about a flat surface, you know, we're talking about real beings and real people, and death is not the only story. And although migrant deaths are really important, and I want to situate those alongside stories of well, other kinds of death, right? The deaths of other kinds of beings, but also the life of these places, and the relationships that these landscapes can teach us about, and that they model for us. And by us, I mean like us westernized peoples who think in these, are trained to think in these classificatory systems, and are trained to reiterate those classifications every time we work and rewrite. And of course, what all of us here today are seeking to do it as we talk more is to really destabilize those, and try to convey something about the materiality of these relationships, and I don't even know what else to call them. I mean, this world, but also, you know, to suggest that parts of our world, like these soils that go thousands of feet, you know, below the so-called surface, like they do their own thing, right? They don't need us. They're not they don't need to be in a relationship with humans, but they are in a relationship with all kinds of other beings, right? And those relationships have absolute, you know, meaning, and we need to respect those and allow those beings to do their thing.
Okay. Yeah. I share your anguish to some extent. I mean, in terms of being trapped in this way, but Christina made a distinction between learning and knowing, which I think is an interesting one. But I want to push it a little further, or just to clarify it. Maybe this is what was meant. You know, that Anu and I, you know, I mean, take this position that people do not just see things differently; they see different things. So even when we talk about beings, you talk about soil, and you talk about interrelationships that occur. You may not be sharing the same sightings of beings that anyone else does. So that requires speculative thought, And this, to some extent, is what we have embraced as a pre-disciplinary moment. That and in a pre-disciplinary moment, we have to question disciplines. I mean, we are questioning geography. I mean, I brought up this example in another situation, you know, where people, you know, I mean, I should say, I mean, we were challenged. Anu and I were challenged by a scientist once who was making a catamaran to sail around the earth. You know, I mean, this is an Indian scientist. I mean, he was a phenomenal man. And he told us, you know, after listening to one of our presentations, he says, what you're calling for, or what you need to consider as a possibility, is being in the ocean in a dark night, you know, in the middle of the ocean in a dark night. In a moment like that, geography is not going to come to your rescue. But most native peoples, I mean, particularly the, you know, Polynesians, I mean, they would thrive in a situation like that. I mean, I know for sure, you know, at least from writings, that the Greeks, I mean, feared this. I mean, I know that I mean, many people, I mean, in the world feared this situation of being in the open ocean in a dark night where you do not know where here is or where there is. You don't have a here or a there. You don't have space and you don't have time. You just have, you know, you have a world that you have to navigate. And yet these people did it without. Now, I would think that that is what should challenge us. We should challenge, and what is that ground? That ground that is that, you know, the ocean in a dark night, and maybe a stormy night, you know, where we can't turn to any discipline, no GPS, no this thing, no here, no there, no surface, no, you know, I mean, that requires speculative thought. I mean, and that is beyond learning, you know, or maybe it is a kind of an apprenticeship to, you know, to these people. And I feel that that is the humility that we need. I mean, I think we should put down our pens to some extent and just, you know, engage in this speculative thought and in this pre-disciplinary moment of looking at these people, not just as people who are seeing things differently, but people who actually see, sense, you know, and have a different common sense that comes from different things.
Thank you, DILIP. I'll also ask the audience if there's any questions that you would all like to ask this incredible dialogue. Does anyone have a response to or a thought that was provoked by DILIP's comment?
Just to say that I love the challenge of speculative thought and what, you know, what that might look like for me, for instance, in what I'm trying to do. I don't know, but I like the challenge of it. So thank you for that.
I guess my question, DILIP, would be, what are the preconditions to have the freedom for those speculative thoughts, given kind of material constraints within our westernized worlds, right? You know, how do you kind of create the space for that ability to open up imaginative possibilities? And that's, you know, both a personal question and a question of practice.
I mean, I don't know if I have the answer to that question, I think, but I mean, I would say that this is why, I mean, I relish my training as a designer. You know, it has allowed me to question disciplines, question. I mean, particularly, I mean, I find everything that's grounded in geography. I mean, geography is the ultimate colonizing discipline. I mean, it has colonized our imagination and it has colonized the world. And we take it for granted. I mean, and I think that there is a simple task for us all to just not do what geography tells us to do. That's it. I mean, you can just begin there. I mean, and I think that is what I've seen in all the talks today. You know, it is going beyond surface imagination, because that is what geography ultimately begins with. It is the writing of the Earth's surface. If you just shelve that I think in one way or another, I think we're all doing it, whether it's the soil, whether it is the, the landslide. I mean, I see in the landslide, I mean, I see the slippage of the surface. I mean, I see the whole slippage of civilization, which is just fantastic. And so it's, I mean, I think that's just a good start, a via negativa start, perhaps.
I mean, I don't think that, just to respond, I don't think that there's a precondition, right? It's about the messiness of that. It's about the, that is the proposal, right? Like it's about, for me, I think about it as bettering conflict, not about eliminating conflicts between these ontological dissenses, right? Like these different realities that, as what DILIP was talking about in terms of the fact that one is using a similar word, but talking about completely different realities, and that there's not an acknowledgement of that, right? That when the soil scientist is saying soil and the farmer is saying soil because they have to dialogue with the science, right? They're not actually referring to the same thing, and there's not a thing, there may not even be a thing on this side, right? There is a thing for right? And so that's the proposal for me, is about, it's not about getting, becoming in agreement, right? But how do we actually create conditions for bettering the conflicts between worlds that are completely incommensurable or partially connected, or like these other, right? Like thinking about partial connections where there are moments of, we're not going to be in agreement, right? There's actually conflicts that are not going to be resolved, and that we shouldn't try to resolve them because that's actually violent, and that's another kind of violence, right? And staying in that place of the dissensus and flourishing in that, right? And that's a proposal for how to decolonize, most of the disciplines, especially for me, like I'm coming from engineering right now, is just like, such a, like, how do engineers to, I mean, because we're dealing right here in a situation of after a huge avalanche, right? And these mitigation projects, and they're trying to mitigate the rivers. They want to attack they want to kill the rivers, right? I mean, and there's a whole logic that engineers just cannot get out of the mitigation project. And anyway, so how do you reconcile, right? And I think that's the messiness. It's not about the conditions don't exist. They don't exist, right?
I wonder if also, to what degree the imagination as a kind of, as it's physically manifested through technologies and media might be a part of this too, of what are kind of our representational possibilities in imagining new worlds. And obviously, DEBJANI, you spoke about this at length. I wonder if you want to kind of chime in on your thoughts of the role of technology and kind of limiting worlds that are seen as alternatives, and how maybe kind of ruptures within those might open up other possibilities.
Yeah, so I think also, especially with photography and the early history of photography, there's this desire to capture the invisible, to capture that something that can't be seen, whether it's microscopes or with the seismograph or telescopes, right? Yeah, I see that. I see the limits of that. I don't believe that there's a place, like Allison's comment says, I don't believe that there's a place for that in the dark ocean. And one of the questions that really interests me about the earthquake is its different kind of sensory sort of order that it appeals to. So even with, like, when you experience an earthquake, you kind of like feel it with your entire body, and it isn't just about vision and making something visible. So yeah, I think that there's especially when it comes to media and technology, there's a lot of limitations that I see.
This is not a comment on what's been said, but I was just, Vinita, when you were talking about the desert and the border, and we've done some work there, also, and been watching them dragging these tires along and just trying to level everything. And it was interesting for us because for the work that DILIP and I are actually at this particular moment engaged in, because you are coming from from soil, and we are coming from, in a way, wetness, and in fact, wetness finally took us to the desert, actually. And so we are working in the Thar Desert in Northwest India right now. And it's fascinating because historically, when you look at documents which are being written, it's desert is always about non-life, like it's dead, and and things which do survive are under so much stress. The whole idea of adaptation, stress, is the whole language which has been built up because it comes from, as you said, somewhere else. And we are sort of looking at these environments, and and how do you start finding other moments, other ways to start framing this? And we found that, wetness is so potent in the desert, or practices. And we found that, especially in this area of Northwest India, the way, in certain areas which have not been as developed, let's say, even though canals and, trying to ameliorate the soil practices are coming, that, desert soil is meant to be dead. And so you have to kind of bring fertilizers and it needs to get more water. There's some standard water. There's all these projects which are underway or waiting in the wings in some of these parts to, in a way, kill the desert. But it is fascinating to think it's not only just the animals, but the people who are still living there, how they've actually worked with that. And, we came to always think that they are in stress, and we just think that is their being in some ways. But, I was thinking about it, but as designers, it's not so much, I think when DILIP is talking of speculation, we don't feel like when we've gone there, we've, photographed, document, just been there. But we feel it's not that we are documenting people or practices in terms of documenting it. We are sort of getting, in some ways, inspired or moved. It's partly documentation, but it's our speculation that has got moved out of it. And of course, since we work with a kind of visual medium, we are in an interesting tension between using the visual medium, but saying something beyond that. And so we are at this point engaged in a series of drawings that are sort of being developed and writing simultaneously just to try and capture this. And so it's not that we feel that what we are writing, like sometimes alternative stories about certain, what are seen as entities and things. We feel that everything, whether it's an oasis or it's a village or it's a dwelling, everything is made into entities. And to find a way of writing that does not have to fall back on that has been a struggle, so we started by almost having to deconstruct what we've written and deconstruct. And, I should probably give it to DILIP because he was just today, sort of struggling on one of these areas which are called orans, which are, translated as paradise or desert. As a kind of oasis, but it's really not that, it's just an intensification of certain relationships and wetness, which, is everywhere. So it was quite fascinating to think about, the desert on the border, which is seen as lifeless and could become a natural border. So, and in some ways, as you say, the Border Patrol intended people to die, but they just thought that it would deter them, which never quite happened. Yeah.
I also wonder about the kind of words that are not translatable when thinking about language. I know, Christina, you mentioned this, and I think that's also an interesting point here of the kind of worlds created by particular languages, as opposed to language and the universal and its kind of shortcomings.
Yeah, I was really struck a couple of years ago overhearing a conversation or being part of a conversation that some volunteers with No More Deaths, which is a group that works on the border to try to prevent the deaths of migrants walking through the border. And they, some of these volunteers had gone to visit Ofelia Rivas, who is an Otam elder. And No More Deaths has a discourse of the desert as this place of death. And she really challenged them, and she said, the desert is our mother for Otam people. And when I was overhearing the conversation, it really, I really wanted to find a way not to replicate, what Riva said, because that's not my place, but to bring this place to life to the extent that I can, and trying to yeah, change the way that I write about these things that are, you know, that create the ground, the soil, and speak of it as life-giving and life-generating. Yeah.
And Juanita, there's something. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, please, Christina, please go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to respond to Juanita saying that that's really fascinating, right? The political tension, because of the need for, in terms of human rights violations and in terms of trying to, you know, have incidents in policy change, the need to create this harsh environment and to emphasize this kind of death trap and this sinking into the darkness and almost cemetery, right? Creating of a fossa común or something like this. And at the same time that on the other, with this tension with indigenous, right? You know, ways of relating and knowing and being, right, in the place, and that it's not a place of death, right? It's a, you know, it's the conditions of life and death that there, right, which is different. And I think that's really interesting in terms of the political consequences of the way you write about it for these different struggles, right? The struggles of indigenous folks and the struggle for in terms of like migration policy change and human rights. Anyways, that was just something I think is really interesting and very important, right? Thinking carefully about.
Yes, because I mean, you know, I could easily replicate a settler colonial narrative that is essentializing this desert as a place of death. But yeah, I think politically it's really important not to do that, and to not do what geography wants, right? And just, well, I mean, yeah. Really, geography wouldn't want me to essentialize the desert as a place of death because it's not, right? But I mean, as a geographer, that's not my job to replicate that. But it is such a prominent narrative that it's activists on the border are constantly doing that, and constantly negating then, you know, other ways of other ways that the desert and this, well, that this world comes into being, and yeah, negating the, you know, indigenous peoples' cosmologies, but also all of the other beings who do their thing with or without people.
Just to go ahead, Dilip.
I just very quickly, I just want to say one of the things we do is actually to shed the term desert. Desert is a surface occupant. It's a land occupant. I mean, and it's one of those classification schemes that I think Christina was talking about, is very much a Western thought, but I hate to use Western. It's a geographic category. And so, you know, when you talk about, when we are looking at the tar, you know, we are saying that the tar is seen as a desert by, you know, on the ground of a surface, but on the ground of wetness, it is not seen. It's you cannot describe it as a desert. I mean, you have to find another way. I mean, and that allows us speculation. So we use that as the opportunity to diverge.
And yet there's, you know, there's places in which the kind of identity of the desert and its kind of cultural history is a symbol of resistance to, you know, in Brazil, in the Sertão, for example, to colonial and kind of coastal elites. And there's the cangaceiro, which is the bandit whose name comes, you know, in opposition to the coast, the colonization. So in shedding even those kind of terms, I think there's multiple layers to peel away. I think we might have time for one more question. Is that, Allison, is that true? Sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I was going to maybe try to bring it to a close. I'm sorry, it's now 5:51 and I don't want to squash any energy. So I will open it for sort of final words, but I think probably for everyone's energy level that this is a good time, or I'm leaving it open. Debbie, what do you think?
I think unless there's people have last final words for this time, until next time, maybe we bring it to a close.
Yeah, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much. I almost, you know, I was trying to tell everyone we'd stop at 5:45 for everyone's energy level, but I feel like it's just getting going. It's been so great. I mean, I hope we stay. So next conversation, we're going to be talking about what we're calling othered grounds. And it's interesting that we sort of ended on this conversation around the desert, which is, you know, as life generating, you know, as a ground that has sort of been othered, where the term itself is almost a means of othering it, as DILIP was saying. I mean, I hope we remain in this sort of terrain of speculative thought, but the next conversation, if Jared, if you don't mind just putting up the slide, I'll just give folks a sense of what's to come. So similar to what, you know, DEBJANI was talking about, the sort of embodied registration of the tectonic ground, the next conversation is really focusing on the body. And I'm going to use the body as a comprehensive term across all different bodies, but really the body and its relationship to the ground, you know, focusing really on bodies that negotiate the ground outside of what we deem sort of normative frameworks. So we'll be considering how the ground is structured by dominant systems to which, you know, quote, others must conform. And we have a whole lineup that you see here. And, you know, these sort of queer, gendered, racialized bodies, otherly abled bodies, non-human bodies are all distinct clearly in their ground negotiations, but share their exclusion from hegemonic structures of ground formation. So we're bringing these conversations together to hopefully generate new thinking around that form of embodied negotiation. So thank you guys so much again. This was such a pleasure to be in your presence and part of your energy. And thank you, audience that have persevered until now.
Thank you all. My goodness, what a privilege.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you very much.
Turn my off.
Thanks so much for curating this really amazing series. It's